Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your interest. And I have a privilege and honor to host today a very distinguished diplomat with amazing diplomatic career, Rosemary DiCarlo, Dr. Rosemary DiCarlo, who is the Undersecretary General of United Nations for Political Affairs and Peacebuilding. This is a new title of the of Rosemary DiCarlo, and Peacebuilding. So previously it was separated. Rosemary DiCarlo is American a diplomat who had a fantastic career working around the world, in Moscow, in Europe, everywhere. And we met first in 2007. I was appointed as ambassador of Ukraine to the United Nations, and Rosemary was in American mission to the United Nations. And she performed fantastically her duties there, being the deputy ambassador to the United Nations in the rank of ambassador, representing the United States in the Security Council. She was everywhere, and still she's everywhere. On the monthly basis, or even more frequently, she's appearing in the Security Council to brief on whatever, on Venezuela, on Syria, on Libya, on Ukraine, on whatever. So we have a really important, interesting guest today who is very open to discuss any questions about the world affairs, which are not clear. They're not well understood even in the expert community what's going on. And of course, the vision from the United Nations is very important. But of course, the openness is limited because Rosemary is on duties, and that's why she is to balance. She's representing the body, which depends on the membership. But at any rate, she promised to be as open as possible. And we'll start with a short presentation, and then immediately question and answers. And this time you will be the first to ask, to give more space to you to ask, and then I will mitigate with my questions, which are not very easy, even for me, to formulate them in a way to have a good answer. So, Rosemary, well, you're welcome to.
Thank you, Yuriy. I don't know if I can live up to that introduction.
By the way, I forgot a very important moment of your biography. Rosemary had lectures at Yale for 3 years, starting in 2015, and in Jackson Institute, and it was about the multilateral institutions in the 21st century. It will be one of the questions about the multilateralism and the role of United Nations in the 21st century.
Thank you, Yuriy. It's a real pleasure to be back at Yale. As Ambassador Sergeyev has mentioned, I did teach a course here in multilateral institutions. Well? Is it not working?
Yeah, it works.
Yeah, and. I was here soon after I had left the U.S. State Department, and I was drawing on my experience representing the United States in multilateral fora, especially the United Nations. Today, I'm official of the United Nations. I have not one state that I work for, but 193 states. It's quite different. And the department that I head plays a very central role in UN efforts to prevent deadly conflict and build sustainable peace. We've got a global mandate. We have political missions in Afghanistan, Colombia, Iraq, Libya, Haiti, and Somalia. We have envoys that are addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, and Myanmar. We also have envoys practicing conflict prevention at a regional level in East, West, and Central Africa, and Central Asia. And we provide support to the UN Secretary General in his engagements across the world when he uses his good offices to mitigate conflicts. And we're increasingly involved in work with countries where there is no formal or no formally mandated peace process or peace operation by either the UN Security Council or UN General Assembly. So the question, the title of this talk kind of raises the big questions. The pressive demands of my job means that I don't often think of the bigger picture, putting out daily fires. So I'm particularly happy to have this opportunity to talk with you and share some of my thoughts with you today and hear your perspectives on multilateralism and the future of multilateralism. I mean, we're having this discussion today at a very difficult time. Far from having any new world order or a preserved old order, what we see is unease and uncertainty around the globe. We have intensified competition among major powers, a perception that we face threats that are more serious than we've seen in a generation. We have persistent conflict, accelerating climate change, and new forms of warfare deriving from technological change and without international governance. In our core work of conflict prevention and resolution, we're seeing some negative trends. There are three that stand out, and they're sort of intertwined. The first is that conflicts are increasingly intractable. The average duration of civil wars has risen over time, and it's reflected in the increased average duration for our peace operations and political missions. Second, an abundance and fragmentation of non-state actors and armed groups. Think of Syria. Conflicts today often feature complex and decentralized non-state armed groups with loose and fluid chains of command. Some adopt terrorism as a deliberate tactic. Some target the UN, complicating our acceptance as an impartial actor by all sides. And third, increased regional and international involvement. Conflicts are increasingly affected by competition for power among regional and other actors, as well as factors such as migration. The priorities of influential neighbors or international actors can directly impact on our ability to resolve conflicts. Together, these factors contribute to a sense that we've lost traction on major conflicts. Also contribute to increased calls for isolationism and closed borders, and feed skepticism about multilateral efforts. Yet, as Secretary General Antonio Guterres has frequently observed, this is a moment where there is arguably more need for multilateral cooperation and collective solutions to a range of problems that transcend borders and regions than at any other time in the history of the United Nations. How do you explain this and respond to this central paradox? My view is that a questioning of the relevance of multilateralism is rooted in divergence among states in their interpretation of the basic principles on which the United Nations is based, principles that have defined international cooperation for the past 7 decades. This underpins a tendency to circumvent rules and lead some states to seek to redefine their roles in a multilateral system. When the UN was established 74 years ago, its member states committed to the sovereign equality of all states, to refraining from the use of force, and to taking collective action regarding threats to international peace and security. These principles are outlined in the UN Charter, to which all member states of the United Nations, all 193, have pledged adherence. They were developed by the victors of the Second World War, still major powers that exist today, but there are new powers now that weren't part of the creation of these rules, and even those who were interpret them differently. Let's take just one principle that's enshrined in the Charter, sovereignty. To many countries, sovereignty does not mean that a state has the absolute right to do as it chooses. It also means that a state has responsibilities, not only to its own citizens, but to other states. A responsibility not to pollute the environment, to prevent terrorists from crossing borders, to curb the flow of weapons, to abide by international human rights and humanitarian law. But to other states, sovereignty is deemed absolute. This has limited the UN's ability to prevent and resolve conflicts in many parts of the world, including, perhaps most obviously, Syria. Meanwhile, many people are losing faith in the process of globalization. They feel left behind. Around the world, we see the rising appeal of nationalist and populist voices. Demonstrations are affecting countries from the Middle East to Latin America and the Caribbean, and from Europe to Africa. While every situation is unique, one common thread connecting all demonstrations is a growing deficit of trust between people and political establishments. This constitutes a rising threat to the social contract. Yet not all the news is bad. Indeed, if we look back at the high-level week of the General Assembly this past September, more world leaders than ever before descended on New York. The climate crisis quite rightly topped the bill in terms of their attention, and beyond states generated an extraordinary mobilization of activists, many of them young, demanding change at the Climate Action Summit. Now, as a collective body, the UN General Assembly itself counters the idea that unilateralism could be the answer to the world's problems. What we heard from a number of member states is that many of today's challenges cannot be addressed by one state or a few states alone. For some issues, the way forward lies in more, not less, international cooperation. To quote the Secretary General, however, he said many times, and I'll quote, "It is not enough to proclaim the virtue of multilateralism. We must prove its added value," end quote. And I would add, and collective action must be for a defined purpose based on principles that are commonly agreed. So, what do? What does multilateralism look like in practice? Well, the short answer is just one word: partnerships. There's not a juxtaposition between multilateralism versus regionalism, for example. Multilateralism can mean a few states working together to solve common problems, or an organization like the UN working with regional organizations or international financial institutions. I just want to say that my department has liaison offices with just about all the major regional organizations out there. Certainly the African Union, European Union, NATO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, ASEAN, and a number of others. But these partnerships have to go beyond states and regional organizations and beyond intergovernmental bodies to include civil society, the private sector, women's organizations, and youth, all of whom make an important contribution to global international cooperation. Now, while we're still wrestling with existing threats and challenges to security, and to name just a few, migration, terrorism, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, arms transfers, we still have new challenges to address: the impact of climate change on security, and the benefits and risks of new technology. I think that you would probably all agree that not one country can solve these challenges alone. So I'm going to end here. I'm really keen to hear your views, in particular on how you see cooperation that is needed to address today's security challenges, and your role in helping to realize it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, indeed. Thank you, Rosemary, to be concise and comprehensive at the same time. So, now the space is open for questions and answers. Should I start or you will? Please. Okay.
Just wait for the microphone to come to you.
Okay. Well, so there.
I was too clear.
No. We have traditional speakers, well, from Germany.
Thank you very much, Ambassador DiCarlo. Just to kick off the discussion, can you give us an example from the last 12 months, a positive example coming out of the Security Council that helped resolve a current conflict?
All right. I think, should we see one out of the Security Council, or something that was resulted from the intervention of the United Nations?
Your choice.
Can you turn your mic down?
No. Yes? Okay.
Okay, I think there are a number of positive examples that I can cite. Of course, some are still a work in progress. First of all, I think the role that the UN has played alongside the African Union in Sudan for the transition in Sudan is a very positive development. It's work that was done very quietly, behind the scenes, with the strong support of the UN Security Council. We've seen a transition to what we hope will be a stable civilian government and a society that is trying to work through a number of reforms to not only improve the economic potential of Sudan, but to deal with the needs and the desires of the society. So I think that's one that I would cite. And again, as I said, it's a work in progress. And it's going to demand a lot more attention, not only from the United Nations and the African Union, but from many, many member states to help Sudan through this transition. This one. Another one, and this is a one that probably doesn't get a lot of attention, and it lasted over 20 years. I think it's 25, actually. We managed to produce an agreement between Greece and the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia on Macedonia's name. It may sound as if this was not a conflict that was an armed conflict, but it certainly was a huge irritant not only for North Macedonia and its movement forward, but for the entire Balkan region. So I really think that this shows that persistence actually can make a difference. Our envoy who handled these negotiations did it for the full 20-some-odd years. Those are two examples I would give you. I think that highlight the work that can be done quietly behind the scenes. There are many examples, obviously, where peace has not been achieved. I mentioned Syria. We're still working on Yemen. A lot of things out there that have to be attended to. Thank you.
Thank you for opening this discussion. Well, of course, the question is very close to the more difficult one, that even supporters of the United Nations do believe that the United Nations was created last century as a product of the Second World War outcomes. And it's not easy to be well adapted to the challenges of the 21st century. And the question to all of us is what to do to adapt the United Nations based on the old charter to cope with the challenges of the 21st century. And the department is, well, thinking about that, I guess, and you have some instruments.
Yeah, I think there are two areas I'd like to cite. First one is on new technologies. And obviously there are tremendous benefits and there are also risks. And my department has set up an innovation cell to deal with the issue of new technologies. How do we use big data to help us assess the mood of, let's say, particularly outlying areas regarding the peace process? Artificial intelligence. What are the good uses of artificial intelligence in trying to prevent conflicts or help resolve them? But then there are also many risks, and we know this. There are certainly risks with artificial intelligence. The risks that we see with social media now and hate speech, which has become a huge issue in many parts of the world. So I think that we have to find ways to deal with these new challenges, if you will, or threats. We don't have the means or the mechanisms. We don't have international partners. We're sighted. And at some point we will need to develop. Another area that we're working on, which is new, we all talk about climate change, but there's also the impact of climate change on security, on peace and security. And we see this with farmers and herders. We see this obviously with the Pacific Islands, who are fearing that they're going to be risking their territory.
That they're going to be risking their territory, and we could see a mass migration of individuals. So there are areas that need to be addressed, some of which, frankly, are denied by a good part of our membership. But we understand, and we see on the ground, that they are challenges that really could cause instability in various countries. Thanks. Okay? Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, your turn.
My name is Ryan Nabil. I'm a former student of Ambassador Sergeyev. In your capacity, you've certainly worked with the Chinese, the Russians, the Europeans. I was wondering, in light of the great power competition that you had mentioned, how do delegations from those countries, how do their approach towards multilateralism, in your opinion, vary from those of the American delegation to the UN?
It depends, it depends obviously on what the issue is. There is a lot of professing support to multilateralism, but again, if we don't have an agreement on a common set of rules, it makes it very difficult to, in practice, achieve that kind of collective action that is needed. I think you also will see that countries come at the issue of resolving conflicts or what is a conflict in very different perspectives. And again, Syria, I think, is a case in point where there were a number of countries that felt that the violations of human rights and international humanitarian law were unacceptable. In other countries that felt that indeed a state has the right to deal as it sees fit with an insurgency or rebellion.
Well, as I told that a few years ago, just prior to this position, Ambassador Rosemary DiCarlo was the president of National Association for American Foreign Policy. And what I noticed, how many efforts she dedicated to find the dialogue, to create a dialogue between three major powers in the Yellow Sea: China, South Korea, you mentioned China, so we're moving to that, and Japan. So, and we had the panel, the top political experts and diplomats there, and that help you, well, to earn a well-deserved authority at that time in the region. And so you are using that now, traveling there, well, trying to find and to create a dialogue, which is absolutely important. United Nations is a dialogue, is a process. Well, am I right?
You're absolutely right. United Nations is a process, and it's, I have to tell you, it's very different being a diplomat for a national service from being an international civil servant. When you are working for your national service, you know what your policies are, or you think you know what your policies are, and you go for it, right? When you're working internationally, you are trying to bring people together. And that is the point. You're impartial, and you're trying to bring, impartial obviously based on certain values and principles that we all adhere to as international civil servants, and that is the principles enshrined in the UN Charter. But it is to bring people together. And I have to say that my past experience, both in the nonprofit world, I think, and in teaching here and in listening to the various views of students, the students I had, every class I had was, I would say 50% US and then 50% from other parts of the world, really has helped me in the work that I'm doing now. It is not very easy, obviously, to be sitting at a table with such divergent views sometimes, but trying to get something together that you can move forward with in order to, let's say, at least manage a situation, if not resolve it.
So United Nations is exactly about that. If you do not want to provoke the right to reply, it's better not to mention neither names nor countries and to speak in that way. For example, about the multilateralism. One of the world leaders, in his address to the General Assembly, recently stated, the future does not belong to globalists.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody knows what's about. Well, no need to give a name or a country and so on. And the reaction immediately appeared from the membership. There can be no return to pre-globalized world. So, of course, this is the competition between the realities which really they're facing around the world. But so this is about the what you mentioned in your in your statement how fragile multilateralism is, but how greatly supported multilateralism has in the global community. And of course, the multilateralism will gain because a lot of the challenges which none of the even big country can cope with alone. Your questions? Well.
Thank you for being here. So the Syrian Constitutional Committee met for the first time, I think, a few days ago, and I was wondering whether you thought of that as a success of multilateralism, and also just generally from your position at the UN, how do you work through the challenge of having to include powers that, say, maybe bomb hospitals in multilateral efforts kind of brokered by the UN, and how you work through that difficulty? Yeah.
Good question. Yes, a very good question, because the Secretary just came back from Turkey for the Secretary General Guterres attended the conference, mediation as one of the major tools how to settle the problems, and of course Syria was on the top of the agenda.
Thank you. First of all, I think after long last, the Constitutional Committee met. I think, is about 2 years in the making, which is quite a long time. The first few days, 150 people, almost 150, a few people dropped out before the conference began. It was 146, met and came up with an agreement on rules of procedure and code of conduct. Just that in itself is, I think, quite amazing. Now, 45 of that 150 are supposed to be working on revising the Constitution. Look, it's going to take a long time. There's no question. This is not going to be easy. If this were easy, it would have happened long ago. But it's a start. And it also gives us the opportunity, I think, while these negotiations are ongoing, is to deal with other issues, maybe smaller, more localized issues in Syria that can improve the situation and make the lives of people better. Things like property loss, certain initiatives that were adopted since 2011 that certainly would discourage the return of refugees. That maybe we can, as we have discussions going on something that is broader and more major, solve some very nitty-gritty problems that can improve the situation for everybody in Syria and for those that left Syria, and hopefully be an encouragement for them to feel that they would be able to return. And our view is the UN, policy on refugees is clear, and it's around the world, and does not just pertain to Syria, but to everywhere else, including Myanmar, for example. That the return of refugees has to be voluntary, safe, and dignified. Otherwise, we are not in a position to encourage that.
Thank you. Okay.
I didn't answer the second part. I didn't answer the second part of your question. How do you sit down at the table with people who bomb hospitals? You have no other choice. Let's put it that way. You have no other choice but to sit with everybody who's involved in a particular conflict and try to move forward and try to reach some kind of agreement on some basic parameters and basic principles to help resolve a situation and move forward to perhaps a better future.
Thank you, Professor DiCarlo. I had a pleasure of being your student a couple of years ago, one of the last classes you were teaching here. Thank you for being here. I have a question. Speaking of cooperation and dialogues, some of the most important dialogues on human rights obviously were happening within the Human Rights Council, from which the US withdrew, as we know, in 2018. And how does it, I would like to know from your vantage point of how does it affect the dialogues in that area, and whether you see some ways around it, and what would be the next steps, and whether there are some countries that are taking the leadership in this area. Thank you.
commendable that the United States left the Human Rights Council. I think that they were a major force for good on the council. That said, I do see the United States still working to promote human rights elsewhere in the UN system and on specific country issues in particular that come before the Security Council. I think that there is an absolute need to, in any conflict situation in particular, but across the board, that human rights has to be a factor and included very much. And there are some who look more to the political aspect of any given situation, some who look to the humanitarian, but I think you have to include all three. And we do see countries taking the lead. There are many countries very committed to human rights that speak out and drive that and drive policies forward to ensure that human rights law is observed and international humanitarian law is observed. So.
Of course, Human Rights Council needs more legitimacy. And we hope that with new amendments to the charter, I hope that it will happen. The council will appear in the text of the United Nations Charter. It is not there. Trustee Council, which is out of date, so is there, but Human Rights Council is not there, and it reduces its legitimacy. Well, so a lot of the reforms ahead. Other questions, please? Yeah, please.
Thanks, ambassadors, for being here, especially Ambassador DiCarlo. There are numerous Security Council resolutions that are either not adhered to or that are violated intentionally. That makes the credibility of the Security Council a bit shaky. Now, granted that these resolutions were able to diffuse major crises, but I feel like these crises are now percolating or simmering. And so my question to you is, what can be done to remedy this this conundrum, this major challenge?
Thank you. And your point is very well taken about Security Council resolutions that are not adhered to, that are violated. Let's just look at, for example, at resolutions that call for arms embargoes on countries. We see this with
Libya, case in point, where arms are flowing into both sides of both warring parties. That clearly the resolution that was adopted several years ago is completely ignored. It's blatantly violated, and we see pictures on TV. And some of the countries supplying those arms will tell you that, oh, there's a need to observe the arms embargo. So it's quite amazing. Similarly, Yemen, again, arms embargo that's being violated very clearly. I think this is an issue that has been raised on a number of occasions, both for countries that have been on the Security Council, for other member states. How do we make these resolutions binding, really binding on member states? And there's been no way to do so. What we see is the Security Council writes a letter sometimes if there's a violation. I'm thinking of the case of Lebanon, where again, we have a situation where arms transfers are in violation of Resolution 1701. And I think it all goes to the credibility of the Council and the credibility of the United Nations. Now, obviously, some would say, those who are sort of deniers of international action, and that the Council overreached in adopting some of these resolutions. And then others would say, no, we didn't overreach at all. It's just that we had no mechanism really to call the violators into question. And that is, I think, a major part of the problem. I don't think we ever will have that kind of mechanism adopted. But I think that the credibility of the Council is really what is, let's say, going to be necessary in order to see greater observance of a number of resolutions. Where does that credibility come from? I think it comes from Council actions and acting early. Often they act late. I'm not criticizing the UN Security Council. I was on it, and I just saw it from within. But sometimes it's hard to get the Council to in agreement to move forward on a particular issue early enough. I think it also comes from the fact that not only the Council, but the United Nations, until very recently, was focused on putting out fires, on resolving conflicts instead of preventing them. I think that's a huge part of our problem, and this is what really needs to be addressed. The current Secretary General has made conflict prevention a priority. It is throughout the UN that we're working on conflict prevention activities. My department does a lot of conflict prevention, a lot of things you will never read in the news, working with countries that are going through various crises, hoping to diffuse those crises before violent conflict erupts. Certainly, the work we're doing in the development area on sustainable development is all geared at also helping to ward off conflicts around the world. I think the Security Council, in doing more early warning and perhaps working on issues where we see a problem coming, perhaps would then end up having the greater credibility. So when they do have to act, they might have more observance.
The new Secretary General took the preventive diplomacy as his major task in his programs. So you remember our colleague from the United Kingdom, Mark Grant, Sir Mark Grant, and at one of the meetings in the Security Council, he made an interesting statement that the Security Council, according to the Charter, was designed to be a smoke detector and not just a fire extinguisher. It is about the crisis management. So he said about that, advising well to work on how to prevent conflicts, how to detect them on the early stages, and what should be done. Well, not to let the conflicts to move to the serious wars and whatever. And Ambassador just mentioned that there is a number of responsibilities of the ownership, of the state ownership, to create a sustainable environment, human rights respect, and whatever. This is the base to avoid any conflicts, any crisis. So this is exactly what Security Council slowly but moving ahead for the recent 2-3 years, maybe 3 years for sure, when Security Council took into the agenda the human rights issues as the source of potential crises, even including the climate change is there now, because it's existential for some of the countries like in the Pacific. It is not just about climate change, it's about the people and their lives. Well, great, thank you. Okay, starting first. You, then you, and we'll move ahead. Okay, then you.
So, from a spectator perspective who follows news on the UN, one would think that the UN is a place where people talk a lot, but they do little. So, how would you reassure people that what the UN does is important for them, and they should believe in multilateral institutions like the UN? And then my second question is, how can you talk less and do more? So, what's the reform that's needed to talk less and do more?
probably need to be able to explain, justify to taxpayers why we are being paid. I'm talking about the Secretariat now. There are two different things. There's the Secretariat and the member states and the various bodies that the member states are part of. But let's just talk about the part that I can have an impact on, which is the Secretariat. I think we do need to do a better job. We are very, very quiet about the conflict prevention areas we work in for a number of reasons. One, we do want countries to think they resolve the issue themselves. We don't want to go in and take credit for something, even if we feel that had we not been engaged, that perhaps conflict over a particular electoral result would have led to perhaps unrest in a country. Secondly, as I said, there is real concern about interference in domestic affairs of a country. That is something that we see many member states concerned about, whether it be the UN coming in or a particular state coming in to resolve a particular issue. And I'm not talking about military intervention. I'm talking about intervention of other kinds. So we're quiet about that. But we do need to do, I think, a better job of explaining what it is we do. I'll give you an example. My department has a standby team of mediators that we deploy. It could be for a lot dealing with elections. I have to say, elections are always a flashpoint in a society. That's not the major problem, but that's the spark that sets things off. Constitution drafting, mediation for a number of issues. We're working on right now mediation and mitigation efforts on dealing with climate change, conflicts between farmers and herders and various aspects. We don't go around publicizing it very much. Countries often don't like the fact that it's you've used them to explain what it is you're doing. On the other hand, it is kind of important for people to know that the Secretariat is working and doing things and trying to resolve conflicts. As far as the talk, there's nothing wrong with talking. I have to say that if hammering it out in the General Assembly or some committee meeting means that by the end of the day you might have changed a few minds or it helped diffuse a situation, there's nothing wrong with that. And it would be better, obviously, if some of the talk resulted in finding a way to have adherence to certain Security Council resolutions, etc. But the fact that people are talking is a good thing. So,
thank you.
Oh, can you hear me? Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for coming, Ambassador. In regards to the fires in the Amazon rainforest recently and the refusal of Brazil's president to make significant changes to curb the fires, even in face of international economic sanctions, do you think there could be a multilateralist effort to curb deforestation that would not eventually disregard Brazil's sovereignty and in the face that the fires reach critical levels in the Amazon rainforest that would lead to eventual UN peacekeeper intervention?
That would be a tough one, I think, to see UN peacekeeper intervention. But again, I think that this is the talk, if you will, dialogue, to be dialogue, to be able to finally address the issue. And yeah, the international help is going to be needed in order to move forward in addressing what we saw were some really critical fires and serious devastation. I think, again, I do think it's very hard to see action the way we might have seen action, right after the Cold War ended, given the differences of views of a number of member states. And we're seeing a divergence now in how the international community should approach different
problems, different, let's say, new challenges. And so it makes it all the harder now. So again, going back to the comment about how can the Security Council do better, or what could it do, or how could it make its resolutions more binding on member states, when you have such divergent views in the international community, it's very difficult. Somehow there needs to be a coming together of what the basic principles that we are all willing to adhere to.
Thank you. and then you.
I wanted to ask, do you think that the UN Security Council can maintain its long-term legitimacy without including additional major or emerging powers as permanent members?
For member states to decide. I think that, look, inclusivity is important. There's no question about it. I think that it's not just a question of adding new members. I think that obviously would certainly make the resolutions that are adopted perhaps more relevant to certain regions. But it's also a question of, again, coming together on what it is the international community adheres to, what are the parameters for their action, and that is going to be the most critical thing, I think, in credibility going forward.
Thank you so much for coming today. So you guys have spoken a lot today about structural reform and the need for reform in the Security Council, and I'm curious how feasible you see some of these reforms being, especially given the veto powers of permanent members. I guess, could you comment a little on that?
Yes, it's delicate for Rosemary to know. But we had a discussion in September on that. We had an ambassador from United Arab Emirates. She's co-chair of the working group on the reforms of the Security Council. So, of course, people are debating. When I arrived in 2007, it was more or less a resolved problem. We had 4 candidates. But then, so the group of the groups have a rush, and we have today 5 or 6 new groups who are fighting for geographical equitable presentation, and now we have a bit chaos there. So, because in any of the regions we have the competitors, if it is one, why not the other, and so on and so forth. Of course, the reforms of the Security Council is not only about the enlargement of the permanent or non-permanent seats, it's about the capability of the candidates to contribute to the global development. Financial, or it is about the technologies, or the human resources. And this is the question. This is the question because the situation is changing dramatically. Those who were on the top, now they are in the middle at least. And so it's not easy to find the solution. Not easy. But again, this is part of the new world order which is on march. We have just a few signs of this new world order, but most probably in the end we have the new composition as we got now after the Second World War, as the product of the Second World War. So today we have 2 things. First of all, the membership, they are involved in the construction of the new world order. Either they are gathering around the major centers, or they are trying to define themselves as a center of the new, one of the centers of the order. So we are in the dynamics, and still the features of the new world order, they are not clear. They are not clear. We see the competitions. We have the different trends, and so most probably in a few years. Ambassador of Arab Emirates, she was not so optimistic to declare that tomorrow we will have the new world order, the new composition of the Security Council, or a new body governing the world. So all of us, we are living in that situation, but what is important, following the question of from the audience, the dialogue is very important. How to bring the diversity to harmonize, to bridge the diversities, how to harmonize approaches, and to define the new rules. So it's a complex question. The new rules, the new behavior, the new respect, the new challenges, how to cope with them, and so they will bringing new players, So there is no exact answer. all the nations they marry to be in the permanent seats, but well, to have 193 countries on the permanent seats, it means that to destroy the council as it is. So we are living in the process, and we are builders of this process as well. How we contribute, or through the criticism, or through something, on the American-Chinese trade dialogue or conflict, how we are managing the and contributing on the finding the solutions in the on the Far East, in the Yellow Sea, between all these countries. So all of us, we are contributors. Even here at Yale, with intellectual forces like that. Of course, what's going on is not new. My question, next question to the on the secretary is that, speaking about the multilateralism, we should also pay attention to parallel going processes like ad hoc alliances, like minoritarian networks. We used them in the past. During the First World War, we had the coalitions of the countries. We had during the Second World War coalition of the countries, and we have today. Of course, they are performing well to fill the gaps or to fill the unreadiness of the international institutions like the United Nations to act immediately. So they are coming. The coalition on the former Yugoslavia, and Ambassador DiCarlo was involved in that process. She knows how it worked from the very beginning. She was in the team of those who find a solution. It is at the time. We have Libya with a different coalition. We have Syria with several coalitions from one side and from another side. We have coalition in Yemen. So my question is, either they are performing in favor of multilateralism, they're also multilateral, but either they are performing in favor of United Nations proclaimed charter principles, or they are trying to substitute and to bring the new way of the managing the global affairs. What do we have with all that?
I think we have a mix. First of all, I always we use the catch-all phrase multilateralism
A lot, and what we really mean, I think, is collective action based on a set of principles that we all agree to. Okay, a rules-based order. Now, the rules may be changing, but you need agreement to change them, and I think that's the key. And sometimes, if issues can be resolved within a country, there's a conflict, and the country manages to come together, and that's great. Or it can be resolved with a few states working with a country. Or it can be resolved by a regional organization or a group of regional countries working on an issue. All of that is fantastic. It doesn't have to be 193 countries professing on the issue, or they come to the UN. So I think that is all the better if it can be resolved at a lower level, a smaller grouping. We have a lot of initiatives, and some of them are absolutely excellent. I mean, I think the point you made about the former Yugoslavia, the contact group that I was a part of for a while, that worked together, and I think helped to resolve a number of issues related to the breakup of Yugoslavia. We see many groupings. We've got Friends of Sudan working on helping Sudan through its transition. We see various either regional organizations or countries coming together on Haiti, on a whole range of issues. And this is good. But I think there's also a question of, it's not just working together. It's a question of what are you working together for? Are your principles grounded? Are we really paying adherence to international conventions and basic human rights and civic and political rights? And is that changing? And I think that's something that we have to look at. It's what are we putting these collective efforts toward? And obviously, I'm not saying that things are sacrosanct and that new rules are adopted. There are changes maybe to certain systems, but there needs to be a consensus, or a broad consensus, let's put it that way, to do that. And I think that we often see today groupings going off in different directions. And while it may be multilateral because there are a number of them, perhaps what they're aiming toward isn't exactly what a lot of us feel is the way forward.
Yeah. So the situation around the global governance, including the how to maintain peace, well, is not easy. We are living in the 21st century. All of us, we know everything about terrorism, but still we don't have definition of terrorism. And it does not help to move ahead with the comprehensive convention on terrorism. So it means to cope with that, we have to fill this normative gap. And in the Sixth Committee, so the debates are still going on in General Assembly. Ambassador DiCarlo mentioned the cybersecurity. Still, we have the institutional gap. Still, there is no instruments how to manage that, including normative gap as well. There is the comprehensive convention how to deal with all that. So still we have legitimacy gap with one of the main institutions how to bring the perpetrators to justice. I mean International Criminal Court. So people are in and out. So it is a question of the jurisdiction of the court, but it is relatively new institution. And some of the elements in its statute, Rome Statute, they appeared only recently. Today we mentioned some elements of that. For example, the crime of aggression. It's a new element in that. And so how to judge? How to judge either it is aggression, or it is a humanitarian intervention, or it is something like around rights to protect. Well, so a lot of work to be done by the experts in the international legal affairs, even from Yale University, from anywhere, to move ahead with all these gaps in international legislation and so, and of course compliance gap. Compliance gap is which exists everywhere because of the differences, both cultural, ideological, political, and so on, and how to bridge them through the dialogue. What is the best platform for that? Of course, United Nations, the only universal institution. Of course, the platforms, the General Assembly 193 is good, but it's also good to work on the working group level. Other questions, please? Well, Ambassador DiCarlo is traveling a lot, so I've been lost the schedule. So recently you were in Southern Caucasus, well, in Turkey, before that in Africa. So that's why huge experience on the ongoing global processes. Well, wish you success. Please.
Okay, I think let me just say,
throughout my career, it has not been, let's say, easy. When I joined the State Department, I joined in 1984. And until 1974, a female diplomat could not be married and remain in the diplomatic service. Okay, so by the time I joined in '84, there were a number of women coming in. So there were not many women, let's put it this way, in up until 1974 in the U.S. State Department. More came in, but they were at lower levels. So it took quite a while for the State Department to really, get on with the gender equality issue. I found myself throughout, my career trying to ignore the fact of whether I was female or what I was, but just try to do my job. Eventually, as I said, we've got now in the State Department a large number of female ambassadors and so forth. I never thought I would make it to ambassador when I started out my career because there just weren't any women at that level. Eventually it happened, and more and more women became ambassadors. The job that I'm in now at the UN, I'm the first woman in 74 years of the United Nations to hold this position. And I didn't think that much of it. Having already been an ambassador, and I realized when I came into the position, two things. First of all, there's a huge burden on my shoulders for all the women who were in the Secretariat who, want to make their way up. I couldn't fail. Not that I wanted to fail, but I certainly could not fail. Secondly, it was quite different and challenging at times because Secretary General Guterres has made a point of gender equality in all assignments, not just senior assignments, but he's done far better because senior assignments he can name. And he's also been trying to help move women up the ladder in the Secretariat. But there is still, I think, a sense of there's a way you act and a way you do things. And what I found is that most women don't act and do things in the same way that a man does in the same position. So while my counterparts were fine, because I had a number of female counterparts as well, it's those that I was managing kind of saw this unusual American woman in a position and perhaps acting very differently from a male who had been in that position over the years. So it was challenging. But what I do find, I think that there is still enough credibility that the United Nations has. So when I travel and I meet with a number of mostly male leaders in countries, then I'm taken seriously. I have a message. I have a message that not only I'm carrying for the Secretary General, who has tremendous credibility, but I'm also representing a number of states with certain positions. And it's not as hard as you might think. That said, I'm always aware, every so often I'm aware that of the differences and the fact that being a female in a position that had always been given to a man means that you've got to work kind of twice as hard. And sometimes it gets a little tiring. Let's put it that way.
Thank you. It was a good question. Well, good question, well, to help the audience and broader to understand this amazing personality. Well, which is not easy. I could imagine that today, Under Secretary General is in the Security Council criticizing, Maduro, and tomorrow she has a meeting with whoever. So this is diplomacy. This is diplomacy. You see, I'm not raising any question about about Ukraine. So,
the gentleman up in there.
Well, I do. I am doing this purposely because in 2014 and 15, Rosemary presided Security Council many times on our issue, and so it was a real assistance how to mobilize the United Nations community, and including in the Security Council. So when we are speaking about the multilateralism, so Security Council is the multilateral view to have the majority in the Security Council it's an art. Well, and that's why I'm grateful. I'm not raising this issue today because I know that there are plans to visit Ukraine and to look and to assess the processes there, and then to bring to the Secretary General the ideas on how to help us in that situation. Well, so thank you. And you have a question?
Has there been a loss of interest in humanitarianism, a loss of any real consensus on it? Because we see in Europe, and certainly in the US, a sort of hostility to refugees, hostility to the most oppressed people, and almost a sort of schadenfreude in wanting, I get the impression sometimes people want these people to suffer. Maybe that's just personally, actually. Anyway, is that the case? Has there been a loss of consensus on humanitarianism?
Consensus on humanitarianism as much as defining it in a different way in some cases. I think that, look, there are issues that one has to take a stand on, okay? And certainly supporting, those who are vulnerable, those who are in need, those who are refugees, migrants, is really, it's an issue that we have to stand by. Perhaps there's a debate on measures, on degree of assistance, etc. But it's clear that there are some principles here that I think for the United Nations, for those of us who work in the Secretariat, we've got to be firm about, and this is one of them. I mean, there are laws, conventions governing, for example, refugees. And these they're in existence, and they should be certainly respected. The situation of migration, there was an attempt at a broad-based pact on migration, which a number of countries opted out of. But we've got a huge problem with migration. The people are fleeing for very good reasons, and there needs to be a way to address their concerns. So I think that it is one of the areas, I think that what we've seen in sort of this breakdown of a social contract among government and citizens in various parts of the world has contributed to this. I think that the fact that people feel left behind and therefore aren't looking to be as open and welcoming as they have been to both refugees and migrants is a serious concern. I know there was a question earlier about how do you deal with, how do you sit down and deal with people who are bombing hospitals? How do you deal with dictators? Well, you've got to deal with them if you want to help, end a crisis. But then you also have to stand on principle on some issues. And I give you one example. I think that the UN has been very clear, and the Secretary General has been very clear about his concerns about how the Rohingya have been treated in Myanmar. He was very clear just this past weekend when he was in Bangkok at the ASEAN Summit about the need for Myanmar to address the issue of the Rohingya, to create the conditions inside the Myanmar so that they can return, and not just the physical conditions, but the political conditions. So there are, I think we have to be, those of us who feel strongly about these issues have to speak up about it. I'll give you an example. I was in a country recently that was having a big debate about violence against women. Some of them thinking that this was, first of all, an internal matter, they shouldn't sign on to various conventions, that it was cultural, okay. And publicly, I said, and I would say again, that violence against women is not cultural, it's criminal. So there are some things that, again, as I may be the diplomat that has to bridge all the gaps, there are some principles I think that are, enduring and undeniable. So.
Well, thank you for your question. It's very important, and we have young students, undergraduates. They are to. I will add some remarks to help them to better understand what's about. So, refugees and migrants. All the refugees are migrants, but not all the migrants are refugees in terms of international law. Refugees are more or less protected by the international conventions. Migrants, they were not until 2015 when a General Assembly adopted a resolution, and then they launched the process. And last year we had in Morocco, we had a summit where the Global Compact on Migration was adopted. And well, to bring both categories to the more or less equal position. The second important issue is responsibility of the parties involved, responsibility of the countries of origin. The global community should work closely with the country of origin to help them, well, to build this sustainable environment, not to push people outside of the country. So the first responsibility is there. The responsibility of the countries of the transition. They are to care about the migrants, refugees. They are to define who is who, and then to either to open doors, move ahead, you are refugees, like with the Syrian migrants running to Europe. So the first countries of entry, they are to exactly define who is who. It's not easy, it's costly and so on. And of course, country of destination. So if they are permitted legally to enter in, so all the international rules should work perfectly to help them with the shelter, with the education for their children, medicine. So this is a complex of the issues, and still we have some normative gaps there, and of course we still have the compliance gaps of all three parties involved in that: country of origin, country of transition, and country of destination. All of them should work together. So, and this global compact of Morocco is about that. So, but I'm absolutely confident that still a lot of work to be done ahead. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, first of all, welcome back. Thank you for coming back. So one of the places where multilateralism at the UN has been incredibly effective is in anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terror. Just in March, was it, that 2462 was passed, and it brought all the anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terror regulations that had been passed somewhat sporadically, and sort of reinforced them and reiterated them and sort of celebrated and reinforced the role of the Financial Action Task Force. But in the NPO and NGO community, there was some concern, because as these are the humanitarian organizations that go into conflict zones, increasingly they're finding it more and more difficult to bank, to get money and aid to people who need it most. The UN in their language said that we must support humanitarian efforts. They must not be disrupted. And that's great language. But if it's up to a bank to assess the value of a client that's a small Muslim faith-based NPO, and they decide, well, you're simply not worth the risk, and so we're going to unbank you. And increasingly, according to a survey, 60 to 70% of these small NPOs do have this concern. Is language alone enough? Can more be done to protect humanitarian efforts being undertaken by NPOs and NGOs in this area? And I was wondering, what are the debates behind the scene to do just that?
Words are not enough, obviously. This is under discussion. There are, various initiatives, mechanisms that are being looked at to try to address this issue. It's a complicated one. It's a really complicated one, because it puts then perhaps the UN in a position of, verifying a particular NPO or NGO or not, which is not a position we have the capacity to do. But I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, on the one hand, we adopt something that is really helpful to a certain end, but then it actually hurts on another aspect of the particular problem, and without having thought through how we might address that. But that is under discussion, and it's a serious problem. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. You were great with your questions. Thank you very much, Rosemary. Thank you for coming back to Yale. Thank you for sharing with us. And of course, all of us, we wish you all the best, success in favor of all of us and the global community.
Okay.
Thank you indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.